good afternoon, and good evening. Hello, my name is Darren Johnson. I am a professor of law at Howard University and a co-chair of the American Society of International Law annual meeting. It is my honor on behalf of the American Society of International Law to introduce to you the Society's Global Engagement Series. As part of the Society's 2021 annual meeting, the Society invites our members and colleagues in each region to participate in 2 weeks of special preview sessions on reconceiving America's global role in the Biden era, international perspectives. Organized in collaboration with Society members and partners in each region, Africa, the Americas, Asia and Oceania, and Europe, each regionally focused session is scheduled to enable participants from within the region to participate live. We encourage all participants to join us at our virtual annual meeting from March 24th to the 26th, and you can register at acil.org/annual meeting. Today's session is the first session of our Global Engagement Series. Today's session focuses on Africa and the United States' place in an evolving international legal order and the impact that a Biden administration will have upon a wide range of critical international legal issues. Today's session is co-sponsored with our partners, the African Association of International Law, the African Society of International Law, the Institute for African Women in Law, and the Pan-African Lawyers Union. Our live audience, all of you, can ask questions through the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It is my distinct honor to introduce today's moderator, Professor James Ghathi, the Wingtot Lee Chair in International Law at Loyola University Chicago School of Law, and a longtime leader in the American Society of International Law, as well as the Society's Vice Presidential nominee.
Thank you very much, Professor Darren Johnson, and thanks to the societies that are co-sponsoring this first Global Engagement Series. It's always been my dream to bring Africa to the society, so this is a dream come true. We have a wonderful panel of speakers. I will introduce them in a minute. The way that we shall conduct the panel is that I have two questions for each of the panelists, and they're going to have 2 minutes. Each of them will respond to the questions, and the audience is free to, of course, put your questions in the Q&A box. I believe is at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And after the second round of this rapid fire questions, we will start answering the questions from the audience. Our first speaker, I'm just introducing them in no particular order, is Raymond Atuguba, the Dean at the University of Ghana Law School. Our second speaker is Professor Japa Dowuni, Associate Professor of Political Science at Howard University. The third speaker is Don Andrea, the CEO of the Pan-African Lawyers Union based in Arusha, Tanzania. Our next speaker is Danga Kamau of Danga Kamau Law. Our next speaker is Professor Caroline Sube, Professor of Law at the University of Cape Town, Department of Commercial Law. And last but not least is Ambassador Namira Negam, the Legal Counsel of the African Union. So it's a really distinguished group of speakers. So here we go with my first round of rapid fire questions to Professor Nsube. Catherine Tai, the United States Trade Representative nominee, has promised to look into more closely into the South Africa-India TRIPS proposal with reference to making COVID-19 vaccines more widely accessible. What do you think should happen here, Caroline?
Thank you, James. Good morning, afternoon, or evening to all the participants joining us. This question is an amazing question. We could spend the 75 minutes on it, but I'm going to have to constrain myself to the 2 minutes. And I would like to take a little bit of liberty with the question. You asked me what the Biden administration can do I want to say what can and ought it to do to make vaccines accessible widely, and specifically in Africa. So I'm going to answer that question with specific reference to what happens at the World Trade Organization, because I think that's the critical playing field at the moment for a number of reasons. We know that the US and the Biden administration can or are able to make quite a significant impact there, because we've just seen it happen with the appointment of the DG, which was delayed for a while whilst we're waiting on the US to join the other WTO members. Secondly, in my view, I think that the Biden administration ought to or should actually take action, because the context in which we find ourselves is quite peculiar and unique. National approaches won't work, because we all know that until everybody gets access to the vaccine, then no one really is safe. And so that for me is the context that drives the normative question of what ought to be done. So taking that then into account, I have two suggestions. The first suggestion is that the Biden administration should not use the USTR Special 301 report punitively against states that use available legal mechanisms to make vaccines available. We saw decisive action by prior administration, the Clinton administration in 2000, when they issued an executive order that said they wouldn't do so in relation to countries that were taking action with regard to HIV/AIDS. I suggest that something similar be done right now. I would also think that such action would be informed by the spirit of the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and public health. And I'm starting there because of the TRIPS waiver proposal, which you just referred to in your question. And so I think that this is the context in which the US ought to think about this proposal. And my second suggestion then is that the administration must take the waiver seriously, as the nominee has said she would. And we also know that in recent time, there have been quite strong calls from within and outside the US for the Biden administration to actually support the TRIPS waiver. And so my second suggestion is take those calls very seriously. And I'm sure James, 120 seconds is up.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. That's very good with the time as well. So Dawn, we are on to you now, and this is about democracy. Given the deepening crisis in Ethiopia's Tigray region, the crackdown against opposition politicians across Africa, and other assaults against democracy in Africa, as well as here in the United States, should the Biden-Harris administration play any role in affirming and or supporting democratic values, and if so, how? You're a civil society leader, so I'm sure you have a lot to say on this.
Yes, thank you very much, James. My short answer to your question would be yes, but with a rider. For this reason, like many parts of the world, a good part of Africa is going through intense challenges during COVID-19. The pandemic and its effect on the economy, on our society, on the polity, has exacerbated what was already a fraught situation in many countries. So I would say two things. One, it is first and foremost the obligation and the task of the African people, African governments, and African intergovernmental organizations to solve the challenges facing Africa. In the past, from time to time, they've demonstrated they can do a decent job with it. I would say that during COVID-19, the result has been less than stellar. But second, yes, the Biden-Harris administration can play a significant role in supporting democratic values in Africa and should do so. On Africa itself, if you look, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Africa CDC, and also at the sub-regional levels, bodies like WAHO, the West African Health Organization, have demonstrated exemplary leadership in the response to the medical and the health aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. On peace and security, on democracy, we haven't done so well. As you say, there's a war that's being waged in the Tigray area of Ethiopia that has involved Eritrea and certainly implicated Sudan. There's a Sudan-Ethiopia issue. Ethiopia is going into elections in August, so we're really crossing our fingers. Over the last 1 week, we have seen Senegal, a country that has been more peaceful than most, descend into chaos. So it's not an easy time. Last year, in respect of Guinea and Niger, at least, we saw a more robust intervention from the leadership of ECOWAS, the economic community of West African states at head of state level. We wish that could have seen, as much, for instance, coming from the political leadership of the AU with regard to Ethiopia, and that's something that we're working on. The US government has strong relationships and strong interests with several anchor countries in Africa and with the AU itself. So what we really hope the administration will do is focus more on dealing with the bodies with the values of democracy, of peace, rather than state to state, country by country, where they may then run the temptation of focusing first on their interest in that country and its leadership, rather than on the ideals and the ideas and the values of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. And now we are on to Raymond. What do you recommend for a US trade investment agenda in Africa, especially in light of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement pending expiry of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act in 2025?
Thanks, James. I'll recommend three things. The first recommendation is a strange one, but Ncube has already mentioned that priority should be to support Africa's COVID-19 recovery process, because not much is going to improve free continental trade until Africa is COVID safe. And the reason is simple. The movement of goods and services, especially in Africa, will be severely hampered in COVID times. And there are also the broader COVID-19 economic shocks that African countries face and which could reverse gains in the last decade. So the first recommendation is really simple. US-Africa Trade and Investment Agenda, recommendation 1, strangely, is to support the rollout of an aggressive vaccination campaign on the continent. The second recommendation is for the Biden-Harris administration to support the AU's The Africa We Want vision, because, as you know, this contains a continent-wide trade bloc, the AfTA. Now, 54 out of 55 AU countries have signed this. 35 countries and counting have domesticated it. So it's impressive. This should have happened, as you know, 60 years ago when the AU was formed. So it's late in the day. So the second recommendation is for this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, to support this initiative aggressively, not the Trumpish way of having bilateral negotiations, no. Not the US-Kenya free trade agreement type, no. We want an engagement with African countries and bloc. Bilateral approaches will break the AfTA momentum. We don't want that. The third thing that should be done, and I think James mentioned a bit about this, is to extend AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, beyond 2025. We are already in 2025. AGOA is set to run from 2000 to 2025. But today, why we need AGOA reform is because now we have the Africa Free Trade Agreement. China has overtaken the US as Africa's leading trade partner. The EU is implementing the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements. The UK is doing the same with Africa, with their own EPAs. So we need a revision, a reimagination of the AGOA framework. And we need that very quickly. Again, the Trump trend of negotiating bilateral free trade agreements with African countries would not work.
Great. Well, you've set up the ambassador very well, because this is, you mentioned the African Union several times. So we are delighted to have you here, Ambassador. And your question is, what are the different fields of cooperation between the US and the African Union that can be revitalized under the Biden administration?
Thank you very much, James. And I think all those who spoke before me spoke about parts of what we do in the African Union with the US. In fact, during the Trump administration, just to be fair, some of the programs still continued as they are, because they were still priorities for the US common interest with the AU. It's not, and with the African continent. So it's not like piecemeal. There were so many things that continued as it was before. But some of the programs we needed, like the perspective had to change because of the perspective of the administration itself. One of the things that we would like, of course, to see a major role continue and be fostered from the US is the peace and security and the relations, not only, as Raymond mentioned, bilaterally, but collectively through the peacekeeping operations and the peace building now, which is more important than even the peacekeeping operations, because for those coming out of conflicts, they need all the assistance in order to rebuild the country and make sure it stabilizes. This goes for South Sudan, this goes for Centrafrique, and so on and so forth. So, and also the second thing will be, of course, countering terrorism, because we have seen now it's not only the piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, now it's increasing in Cabo Delgado in Mozambique. So there are other areas apart from Al-Shabaab in Somalia, of course. So if you look at the map of Africa, now terrorism is spreading, and we need further cooperation with the US in programs to make sure this will be countered. And of course, sorting out the issue of Libya, because this is also a real problem. Now, I hope we are going on track with the upcoming elections. Hopefully, this will be sorted out. We already, of course, AGOA was mentioned. We have a lot of things like now with the CFTA ongoing. We have many things in relation to investments that need also to continue. And just before wrapping up, because of course all the fields are open to cooperation with the US, but with the COVID and its impact, when it comes to the legal impact, I think it's crucial to discuss the issue of the arbitration and investment arbitrations that will come out after the COVID, because we already started to have issues with investors because of the lockdowns and the impact, especially like some countries will classify COVID as force majeure, others will not. So this is where we really need some policy from the Biden administration to make sure not to make our government suffer so much after COVID. We suffered enough within COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Everybody's coming back to COVID. Maybe that's what I should be asking everybody about. And there's a question on the chat, and we'll come to that. I think in part the ambassador answered that question in the Q&A box, sorry, not in the chat. So Professor Dawuni, yesterday was International Women's Day. And I believe the Vice President made an important address. And I see that, Don, your hand is up, so I'm not ignoring you. What can the Biden-Harris administration do to support causes, women's causes across Africa, particularly with regard to foreign assistance for things like poverty eradication, healthcare, reproductive care, those types of things?
Thank you, James, for having me. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I'm going to answer this from two perspectives. One, it's from the symbolic representation perspective, which is what are we doing to showcase that we are really serious about women's rights? Symbolically, the United States has already done that by electing the first woman vice president, Kamala Harris, as vice president, the top leadership position. And also at the international level, at least among the confirmations that have been done, we do see that a woman has been placed at the UN, former ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. So that's a good signal. And she also has a lot of experience in Africa. So that could be something that we hope something good will come out of it. The third aspect is that the Biden administration also has one of the most gender equitable cabinets that the US has ever had. So once again, symbolically, we see that women are represented. And lastly, the Biden-Harris administration has also created the Gender Policy Council, which is going to be focused on gender issues and is going to respond directly to the president, and all cabinet members have to be a part of this. So it really shows that at the topmost level, gender policies are important. Now, how do we translate these numbers into action? That is a substantive representation. A couple of things that can be done, and I think some of my earlier speakers have mentioned it. I'll focus on three. One is that we cannot forget that COVID is real and it's still evolving. So in addition to what my colleagues have said, the Biden-Harris administration, in addressing COVID-19 issues, whether it's aggressive vaccination or making vaccinations available, would have to look at it from the gender perspective, because COVID-19 has affected women disproportionately. And so women have gone out of the working environment, pay scales have gone down, women are increased care work. So that has to be done. The second one, within the health realm, it's also reproductive rights. It's important for people to recognize that when we talk about women's reproductive health, it's not just about abortion, it's about all the screenings that women need. So when we close down, like the Trump administration did with the gag rule, close down policies that would provide women opportunities for healthcare because we think everything is abortion, we are closing down on screenings, life-saving screenings that women need. So the Biden-Harris administration would have to focus on providing and expanding those opportunities. And lastly, from a security perspective, my colleagues have said it before, there are still conflicts happening, unfortunately. Ethiopia, in the Tigray regions, Darfur is still blooming, and DRC. Women suffer disproportionately. And lastly, UN Security Council 1325 resolution has shown that when women are at the table, solutions to conflicts last. So the Biden administration should prioritize women's decision-making roles during conflict and after conflict reconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dewone. So Danga, we are now on to you. Already the ambassador has mentioned something that is in your area of expertise, which is the likelihood of there being investor-state disputes as a result of the lockdowns because of the COVID-19 pandemic, to keep this theme of the pandemic and vaccines in this past round. So there's that, and there's also the general question, because this is the area of your expertise and you've been doing a lot of work in this area. The African Union is negotiating an investment deal. You know, what can, if anything, the US help to support that? You're muted, I think.
Yes, I am. I was. Thank you very much, Professor Gadhi, for this opportunity to join this discussion, and of course to ASO for organizing this panel. I will get to the COVID question, but I would like to start, I think, perhaps with a question on the Continental Free Trade Agreement as regards investment. And here you'll be familiar with my work on this. I'm concerned about the divergence of voices that we see different African countries speaking with. And perhaps a good place to start then is the source of this divergence. So I look at it in three themes. The first is that there is indeed a case for reform. So there is convergence, at least on that question, and the convergence comes from a global perspective. Different states around the world have expressed some discontent with the existing framework for international investment law. Specifically, the discontent arises around the mechanisms for dispute settlement. That's what gets the most coverage. But really, the discontent extends beyond that to the substantive provisions of some of these agreements. And the reason is that they're often quite broad and unclear, and there's inconsistent interpretation of these provisions by arbitral tribunals, which are set up in an ad hoc way. So that's the first theme, really, is that there is a case for reform, which African states also share. Now, the second part of this is that African states are actively engaged in reform. And they're engaged in this reform at different levels, and that's at the domestic level, at a regional level, and that's regional, east, west, south, but also regional now, more continental, as well as at a more multilateral level involving states from around the world. Now, what we see here is that the reform taking place at these different levels risks inconsistency and also incoherence. So we start seeing that states have divergent views on not only the content of these agreements in terms of the substance, but also with respect to the mechanisms for dispute resolution. So we see some states expressing clear preference for dismantling the system. Others want to reform the existing system, but actually most of them have not expressed any view as to the actual shape of this reform. So we start seeing that there's more divergence there as well. The third theme, what we're seeing in this area, is that the most progressive reforms or the most progressive proposals for reform are with respect to those instruments which will implicate African investors. So we're seeing quite strong language on sustainable development, on the rebalancing of investor rights and state rights. But this language is appearing mostly in bilateral investment treaties, BITs, between African states, as well as in the regional instruments and in the proposed investment protocol, which we hear will be based on the Pan-African Investment Code, which is a very progressive instrument. What we're not seeing is the same level of progressiveness in the instruments that implicate foreign investors. And these are BITs with what I guess we could call third states. So with respect to the divergent voices, we're seeing that it's both within the state itself when it has to negotiate different instruments at these different levels, but also between the African states. Now, to resolve this divergence, it really is the responsibility of African states to come together and find a way to collaborate. That's the first point. And I think that's been shared by those who've spoken before me in other different areas of international law. But there is a role for the Biden-Harris administration in this as well. And here I identify two broad areas. The first is a more concrete one, dollars and cents. And this is with respect to technical assistance. So here, the administration could support the development of real capacity excellence at the African Union, for example. So in a center of excellence for investment law, where states could go to get support on dispute management, dispute avoidance, but also with negotiation of treaties and so forth. At the same time, there could be technical assistance to a more multilateral level of reform. So, for example, ANCITRAL is always seeking funds for meetings, for real work like interpretation and translation. So that's an area that the administration could support. Now, my final point is another way that the administration could support the divergence of voices, or rather to get collaboration out of that divergence, is a little bit more abstract. And here, what the administration could do is to support the desire for a regional approach. So this has already been mentioned by Professor Adair, who said that what the administration can do is to resist the opportunities that may arise for bilateral engagement that undermines the continental project. And maybe that was Professor Tuguba who said that. So here is also an area where the administration can actively support the efforts of the African states with respect to the Continental Free Trade Agreement, is really to resist the urge for bilateral undermining of this multilateral project. And I'll stop there because I see I've really abused the time, Professor.
Well,
thank you.
You had the ambassador raised the question of COVID-19 and ISDS suits. You're the expert here. You can't run away from that.
I did try. You saw to fill my time with other engagements, but I think this is an important point that the ambassador raises, and it's a point that really goes to the heart of some of the discontent with the investment law system. And the point here is that when states are faced with extraordinary circumstances, and they have to take measures to deal with these extraordinary circumstances to safeguard health, safeguard the environment, and so forth, is there really a space there for investors to sue states as a result of these measures and the impact that these measures have on them? And of course, it depends on the instrument that the investors invoke and so forth. But there is a customary international law provision that allows states to regulate and to act in this sort of emergencies, the police powers that states have to act in emergency situations. What's been the problem, and that's a problem of case law really, and a problem of interpretation, is that there has not been a consistent approach by ad hoc tribunals in the way that they deal with instances when states have had to react in emergencies. So that raises nervousness on the part of states. I think rightly so, because there isn't a predictability in the outcome of any cases that arise out of these situations. So while the legal provisions may be there, safeguarding or guaranteeing that the states can act in certain ways, there's no guarantee that the interpretation will be in accordance with the intent of the provisions, or indeed in accordance with customary international law. Now I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. I know the ambassador is here and she's listening. I think that the another institution we could mention is the African Union's International Law Commission. I think it can play a really critical role in developing the principles that Danga is talking about in terms of sort of the red lines drawn by customary international law, as we have seen in recent arbitral awards. I know there's a question in the chat. Daniel, we'll come to that when I go to Dawn, because the question you're asking is a really important one. But now we are going to the second round. Professor Nsugbe, I want to come back to you. You're an IP expert, you're an intellectual property expert. Africa actually has, like this panel is showing, it has so much expertise. Africa does not have to hire law firms in Washington, DC, or James Garvey in Chicago. These are people who are based on the continent who can do this stuff. Raymond in Ghana and the ambassador. Anyway, so you've written a lot about this question about copyright, the sort of copyright challenges that South Africa has faced in reforming its law, facing pressure from the US to sort of make it difficult for academic and research institutions in South Africa and elsewhere to make materials, educational materials available online, especially in this COVID-19 era. And so I sort of wanted to see whether you had any thoughts about that you wanted to share with us.
Right. Yes. I was listening very carefully when Danga was talking, and I liked how she spoke about convergence and divergence, and I was going to try and bring this in somehow. So just wait, I'll hook it in. But the question then is a national question. And I think many of the people who've spoken before me have spoken about the international or continental aspect of it. So I'm going to start with the national. So the US administration's involvement in copyright reform in South Africa. That is still ongoing at the moment. My own personal view is that had this been resolved a long time ago, at least before the pandemic hit us as hard as it did and required a move to online education, the new copyright reforms would have indeed made access to educational materials much more easier. However, the reform lingered, was delayed, is still ongoing, so we're not able to meet that need. And part of the reasons for the delay were national consultations, but there was some interface with the US administration to the extent that as a result of a complaint filed with the USTR, a GSP review of South Africa then also looked at the copyright law reform. And so for me, that's really important as we talk about support from the US administration for national IP reform. I think I want to use the word resist. I think there must be resistance to the use of US systems in order to interfere with or delay national reforms. I think there is definitely a role for US administrations to support, but there's also a space, if not carefully watched, where that window can be abused to delay or hinder national reforms. So I want to use the word resist. I think the administration should resist being used in that way. But I also accept that, of course, it does have a role to play as this goes through. Many of us spoke previously about recommendations. So if I'm saying resist being a delaying factor in national reform, what could perhaps be a positive thing that I may be asking the US administration to do? Well, I would say that perhaps also insist on strong evidence before requiring or asking that laws that have been developed using domestic processes that appear on the face of it to have been properly done. Before asking for rewrites of laws, I think there should be an insistence on strong evidence. Then if that evidence does exist, then of course that should happen. So I think that was the national question. I don't know, James, if you introduced an international or continental perspective.
Oh, you're free to do that. This is the area of expertise. You have, another 45 seconds.
Okay, cool. Let me take it running. So continentally, of course, we are entering the second phase of AFCFTA negotiations, and the intellectual property protocol is going to be there. And so that is another space or role that the administration might find itself drawn into. In fact, I believe that the administration has said that it's going to support this process. And so my ask or my request would be for transparency. My sense has been that previous trade agreement negotiations have been cloaked with some secrecy, and that this has not helped. Once you have secrecy, then you have mistrust of the system because stakeholders are not sure what positions are being put forward and whose interests are being served. So my ask in the last 5 minutes would be if the US administration then continues to support this process through whatever means, I think that they should insist on transparency. We should be able to see the position that they are taking and advocating so that other stakeholders can bring perhaps divergent or even supportive views. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And there's a question that sort of follows up on your IP thing. You can answer it on the Q&A. So Dawn, we are now with you, and I want to use the question in the chat and sort of use it to frame the question I have for you. So I like this question. It sort of turns the questions that I'm asking the other way around. What Africa can do for the United States in international law. And I know you're one of the leaders on the continent and in the world in terms of the role of international institutions and using them to advance causes like the rule of law and democracy. Here I'm thinking especially of the very important work that Palu and other groups in Africa have led, for example, on illicit financial flows, on the International Criminal Court. One way of framing this is how Daniel frames it, what Africa can do in international law for the United States, perhaps like what it's done with questions of race in the Human Rights Council. But also, I'm also thinking in terms of how the US might get out of the way for some of Africa's initiatives, like in the context of the OECD with tax questions. So over to you.
Thank you, James. There's quite a lot in there, and one can run the risk of going, on and on and on, trying to address all, but I'll just try and limit myself a bit. And to say yes, I think there are two things that are important. It's about how African states and African institutions, and more broadly, institutions from what you'd call the global South, can strengthen their hand and their voice in international processes. And that for us is a key focus. There's the flip side of that, saying how do we get some of our friends internationally to get out of our way, which is, I think, part of the question you asked. And indeed, I would say, yes, friends, yes, US government, yes, a fresh start under Biden-Harris. Please see how you can get out of the way of international reforms that are important, not just for us, but for everyone. And I think Ndanga has made the point, I think Raymond has made the point, I think Caroline also did, that for us, a big issue in 2021 as Africa was the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Of course, it's been challenging to launch and roll out in these COVID times. But on the bright side, rolling it out dynamically and pragmatically might be what mitigates the gaps in supply chains, in value chains, economies that have been wrought on us by COVID-19. So as Raymond has said, it's in such areas that we are wary of fast-tracking bilateral trade agreements and would rather a continent-wide approach to rolling these out. Again, when you talk of IFFs, illicit financial flows, just 2 weeks ago, we witnessed the launch of the report of the United Nations High-Level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency, and Integrity, the UNFACTI. And quite pleasantly, its recommendations were actually more far-reaching than we had expected. They went so far as to call for a UN tax body to replace the role that has been being done by other institutions, such as, for instance, OECD. This is what we've been calling for, of course, as African people and with our colleagues from the Global South. We were skeptical that the FACTI panel would go that far, and we are glad that they did. And it is important for us that they did, and that they focused on the reform of international tax and reform of international economic governance generally. So we expect that there'll be pushback on this. We'll expect there'll be pushback on this from some of the powerful states that are now in the commanding heights of international financial institutions. We expect there'll be pushback from, institutions such as OECD, who have had an outsized role in determining what happens. So yes, we would call for restraint of the US in interfering with or slowing down these processes. But more importantly, we are focusing on how to strengthen the voice and the hand of African states, of African intergovernmental institutions, and of developing states generally, so that we actually do have reform of the UN, especially around institutional innovations and especially around international tax and the economy. Thank you.
Thank you. My panelists are so good that they're keeping time and answering the questions without dodging them. So Raymond, we are back to you. And you set the tone here about we need continental solutions, and the US shouldn't break Africa into bits and pieces and negotiate with them one at a time. Do you see any potential in this Biden-Harris administration for any breakthroughs in US-Africa relations?
Definitely yes. It's early days yet, but we can see some very promising developments, I would call them. You know that in his very first days, Biden issued a number of orders, including the signing up the US to the COVAX scheme to deliver COVID-19 vaccines. Ghana, from where I'm speaking now, was the first country to take delivery of the vaccines, and I actually plan to get my vaccination tomorrow. We also know that the US has rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, and travel bans for at least Nigeria has been lifted. Biden was also invited to deliver a message at the recent 34th summit of the AU, the African Union. And he talked about a shared vision of a better future for US and Africa relations. He mentioned trade and investment, climate change, of course, conflicts, trying to end conflicts, human rights, and a few others. And we also know that the Biden administration supported the new WTO DG, Ngozi, and is generally more committed to the WTO and strengthening the multilateral trading system. But there are some things that I think should be done beyond this. First is to change the entire extant narrative about the country, about the continent of Africa. These are not my words, so you must excuse me. The narrative about Africa as a continent of shithole countries, that narrative must end. There's absolutely no justification for it. That narrative sets Africa in a certain light and then allows the world to view her in that way and to react to her and relate to her and her peoples in that way. It's not acceptable, and there must be a fast-track process of ending that narrative. The second thing is within the multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. We need, and I'm saying this because the US has a strong role in those institutions. It dominates them quite a bit. We need a depoliticization of the macroeconomic policies in these institutions. There isn't much time to elaborate, but one thing that the Biden-Harris administration can do is to allow for African monetary policies to be more open to domestic African intellectual and policy debates and direction. The third thing they could do is, and this is on China, to reassess the US's reaction to the increase in Africa-China trade, not in the Trumpish way of reacting to it as in competition with China only, but reacting to it by focusing on what is important also for African countries. Again, there isn't much time to elaborate, but I know you get the sense of what I'm saying. And lastly, the Biden-Harris administration must generally take the continent several notches up in their priority list. Africa is the continent of the future. We may not like it, but that's the truth. And they must start putting her and her countries there. There's a quote, when I was preparing for this, there's a quote. Let me just go to that quote. I put it somewhere. By the new chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Gregory Meeks. He says, and I quote, "My goal is to reset the United States relationship with Africa by focusing on shared challenges, expanding people-to-people relationships and exchanges, developing partnerships to increase youth participation in the digital workspace, and championing a more robust presence across the continent." Of course, not in an inimicable way, but in a productive way. So these are the four things I think the Biden-Harris administration should focus on Africa going forward.
Very good. Thank you so much, Raymond. And this sets up the ambassador very well for the next question. When he was running for the presidency, Biden noted that he wanted a more respectful relationship with Africa, very much along the lines that Raymond just mentioned. And he also mentioned the address, the recorded address that he gave at the 34th African Union Summit last month. And I wonder, Ambassador, especially because the previous administration stopped several initiatives that the African Union had with the US government, including one involving my school, the Rule of Law program in Rome, that is predominantly sort of students from Africa and students and your colleagues at the African Union who have really been the backbone of that program. What's the importance of this address? Is it setting a new tone along the lines that of Raymond's hopeful answer?
Thank you very much, James. Actually, I will start by saying from insult to respect. That will be the first comment I would say, because if we're talking about the reaction, definitely, I don't want to repeat the words, but simply President Trump himself, during his tenure, insulted African states, insulted the African people. So the outcome of this insult was a dismay by the summit, was definitely not met with a smile through the continent all across. The address of Biden set a new tone that makes us hopeful. I'm legally and diplomatically savvy when it comes to my profession, so I have to be prudent. I cannot be seeing things as florid as Raymond, but at least I can say, when we start by the head of the new administration saying that we want the relationship to be built on respect and partnership, this sets a new tone. Definitely, some of the things that are affecting others globally affected Africa more, like the issue of Paris Agreement. The return to the Paris Agreement will affect now positively Africa, because we have a fund that supports the mitigation for the climate change in Africa. We are the least continent contributing to the greenhouse gases. But now to develop, we need and we are forced to take into consideration all the measures that others never took when they started industrialization. So now, having basically the US that contributes to like $3 or $4 billion, that will make a huge difference in the funding to these programs in Africa. I like that you mentioned the Loyola program, because I am the one who runs the Loyola, and I'm the one who keeps mentioning it in my meetings with the officials in the US and the State Department. And this is actually one of the programs that, when I was saying some of the programs, we had to change the perspective. When it comes to the long-term training for AU officials, and someone mentioned it's important to train the young people in the continent, especially the AU, because we are the ones serving on the continental level. Loyola program was very useful under the project of the rule of law. But for a reason or another, they decided no, funding for the long-term projects, which is like 6 to 9 months, is not preferable, and they want to keep it for short projects. We did adjust to that, and it's useful. We have an MOU with the American Bar Association, and we have already continued training people. But until today, whenever we have a meeting within the strategic partnership we have with the US, we bring that on board. Just before I conclude, because of course the topic is vast wide, and I can speak a lot about many details, but just I want to pick up on the question that came in relation to what the Africans can do in international law to the US. Maybe because this is like the discussion was more political than legal, we didn't focus on that, but simply, I would have to start by the unilateral decisions taken by the US. It's outside the parameters of the international law. If we are talking about the US taking decisions in relation to sanctions or in relation to the ban towards African states without the legal foundation, it was very difficult for us to do anything there. We can only keep condemning and saying we have to open for negotiations. Now, the new administration is taking a new path, and we are hopeful that this new path will lead to a return to the multilateralism where we build the international law. It's simple. This is where we negotiate conventions within the UN, within the World Bank, like the ICSID new rules. Now we are developing the developments for the United Nations Convention for the biodiversity, or for the trade rules that we are now negotiating for the UNCITRAL and the idea of a new court. This will we will accept back fully the US as a partner in negotiations. We open our doors to discuss all the issues that need to be discussed for the mutual benefits of both Africa and the US. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I don't want to insert myself in the discussion, but you could add the drone strikes that are certainly legal under international law and so on and so forth. But I digress. Professor Dahuni, for your second round, again, focusing on the area of expertise, you've really written authoritatively about African women and women generally, especially in international courts. And I think you'd agree that African women actually can show the US how to place women like the ambassador in important positions in international law, but also in other areas. I wonder whether you think, in addition to what you said in response to the first round, there are other ways in which the Biden-Harris administration steps can take to promote women's leadership in African politics, or even sort of to use the example of the fact that African women populate a lot of Africa's international courts as an example to the rest of the world, including the International Law Commission that has had very few women in over 70 years, which is really a tragedy.
Yes, so Yes, a lot to cover. Let me start off this point that, from an international law perspective, and I think my colleagues, Ambassador and Professor Raymond Atuguba have talked about it. It's about the sovereignty and equality of states. And we know that that's a whole other debate, but this idea of respect, this idea of renaming Africa as this word that we don't want to use is important. And so if we begin to see that, and we're seeing the promises, if we see the actual practices that do indicate the respect, the equality and sovereignty of African nations, that would be a good step to start the conversation. And coming from the international law and going to international relations, I think we also need to be mindful of the theory of complex interdependence. The states are interdependent, irrespective of their location and their size and all of those other factors that we attribute to states. So this idea of depending on one another, whether Africa is not doing much in terms of destroying, producing greenhouse gases, that means that nations will have to depend on our low emission levels, but then also help support these programs. So how do we relate all of that to women's issues? In all of these things that we talk about, whether it's hardcore security questions like drones use and all that, women are affected. If women are therefore affected, they should be part of the decisions that are made. And I want to be mindful that when we're talking about women in leadership, whether it's international law or domestic law, we tend to focus on women at the top leadership positions. Those are true. They have a powerful position to make decisions. But let's not forget women at the other levels, the domestic level. So that brings in civil society actors who engage with these women on a one-to-one basis. So how do we translate all of that? What can the Biden administration do from an international law perspective? Yes, I think as you mentioned, by supporting Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala to the WTO, it's a good signal to start with. And we know that Ngozi comes with the economic and also, vaccines. So we are hopefully going to see some policies that will begin to move. Studies have been done to show that countries that do send, powerful countries, in terms of OECD, or first-class countries or whatever the designation may be, that send women ambassadors to other countries send a signal that they are serious about women's issues, and that can lead to some changes in norms. So one other thing will be waiting to see how many of the women from the US or women from US will be sent as ambassadors. Now moving to the international courts. One thing that the Biden administration can do, given the very slim chance in the Senate that we currently have, is to sign on to the Rome Statute so that the United States become a member of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Another one would be to sign on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea so that the UN tribunal that deals with it currently has only 3 women, one of the lowest in the world. So those are 2 places that we can begin the discussion. Thirdly, even if they are not able to sign on these treaties and statutes, another way would be to support countries that nominate women to these courts and tribunals so that we can have the pool increase. Lastly, on the question about African women, yes, at the ICC, African women have been the highest at the court. At the African Court on Human and People's Rights, we have the most gender balance or representative courts in the world. So how have all these come about? Very quickly, at the Africa level, we have the rights on the convention, the protocol on the rights of women, which we call the Maputo Protocol. So the African continent, once again, has led in showing that we want to promote women's issues, and the Maputo Protocol have provisions that deal with security, that deal with women in decision-making, political participation, that deal with women's reproductive rights. So the Biden administration can once again support the implementation of the Maputo Protocol from the regional level. As we've talked about, we've had a lot of discussion about regionalism, can support the implementation of the Maputo Protocol from the regional level. Lastly, the Biden administration can also support women's issues through the UN SDGs, which also has a lot of provisions, specifically 5 that deals with women, but 16 that also deal with international institutions, justice institutions, and make sure that these supports are directed towards increasing women's leadership positions and also women's ability to lead. And how can that happen? By creating technical skills, knowledge transfer, focused on empowering women leaders at the top level, but also at the bottom level. So through all these policies, hopefully we will get the norm diffusion from the international level from the regional level, and we can begin to see those changes happen and trickle across the continent. But lastly, let me just say, I've heard a great deal about what the Biden administration can do for Africa, the continent, not the country. And I want to say that the other question too is, what can Africa do? And I know that this might be contentious. I would say Africa has been doing a lot already, but I think we also, as individuals, as countries, as a region, would also have to come together as a regional force and see how we can continue to push. Because one thing we can do for the Biden-Harris administration is to hold them accountable. And that we can do within other organizations that we belong to.
Well, thank you very much. And, we are coming to the last question in this rapid fire, and I see no questions in the Q&A, although we have a large audience. So as I ask my last question to Danga, I hope that we'll get questions because I have additional questions for all the panelists. So Danga, one of the areas of expertise, of course, is in the area of international investment law, but I want to ask you whether this new administration promises any opportunities for African countries that they might be able to leverage that might not have been available, especially now that we are seeing this more respectful tone that all the panelists seem to think is a really important development.
Thank you very much, Professor Gadhi, for the second opportunity to join in the discussion. As I was thinking about this question, there's a simple answer, and I think that the simple answer is yes. I think there is always opportunity for African states and African companies and other actors to take advantage of this increased openness. But I think that all that does, or one of the things that does, is that it entrenches the status quo, which is that African countries look outward for their development. And what I think is more interesting is taking this opportunity to look inward. And so this, I think, links in with the point that was being made about how others see us. And I would submit that it's actually more important for us for how we see ourselves. So that if we see ourselves as states that trade with each other and with opportunity for selling goods and services across borders within Africa, that also shapes how we engage with others with respect to trade and investment. Now, this would be, of course, in different areas. And the first is an obvious one, is partnering with American companies, given we're addressing the United States here, with respect to development of cross-border infrastructure, with respect to developing technology for the realization of this continental project. But also there's a second part, which is support with respect to building the legal framework that will be needed to implement the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So it's all very well to have a continental instrument that sets out I think at quite a high level what's expected, but all of this will need domesticated because each of these states will need to reform the legal framework domestically to facilitate cross-border trade, but also to welcome investment from around the region. So we hear a lot about trade facilitation, and that by implication means a really radical change in the way that the domestic investment framework is structured. So I think that we need to really be thinking about this new stage of the partnership between the United States and African countries beyond just an outward relationship, and more a relationship that can also look inward with the support of the United States as a partner. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. So we have about 12 more minutes to go. So I have a final round for each of you. And this has, one of the themes that has emerged really very powerfully is about the importance of Africa speaking in one voice to hold the new administration accountable for all the issues that you raised. Of course, like Professor Doni said, Africa, is a heterogeneous place. It's not, it's one of the largest continents in the world. And so we don't want to sort of suggest that it's easy to speak in one voice. But there are issues on which I think you all agreed that it would be really important for Africa not to be divided. I guess we start in the order that we started at the very beginning. So Caroline, you're going to go first, and then we're going to go Dawn, and then Raymond, and then the ambassador, and then Professor Dawuni and Danga, and then we can close it off. Thank you.
Right. So I think that I want to tap into a conversation I've been having on the Q&A with BC asked a question. So I think as far as intellectual property goes, although there's great divergence, of course, on the continent, each country has its own set of, different circumstances, priorities, and all of that. But I think at this particular moment, this is the moment where there is some convergence, to the extent that, for instance, we've seen the AU pass a decision quite recently saying that they would support the proposal for a TRIPS waiver. So I think there is some coalescence of common interests, and the AU has started to speak with one voice on IP matters. I would say that I would like that momentum to keep going, that I hope that the AU member states are going to use the second phase negotiations, where they will be talking about an IP protocol, as another place where they can come together and discuss common positions and take them forward. And also I wanted to mention that they've already done so, to the extent that the tripartite between COMESA, EAC, and SADC had started to talk about intellectual property, and that would cover about 26 states, I think. So I think there is already a coming together, despite our vast diversity, and I hope that we continue to speak at these multiple fora to consolidate common African positions that we take forward to whatever platform is appropriate, and then of course to take along with us the accountability. And I'm just going to hook in accountability with transparency. Earlier on when I spoke, I said when the US does come on board, they are already on board, I believe, to support the AU in its negotiations of the second phase, that I would very much hope for transparency. And so I think this is one space where then the AU member states can hold the administration accountable. Keep on asking for transparency and explanation of current or future positions to be taken. And I think that will stand us in good stead. So that's my final thought, James. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And I'll try and keep it short and stick to two things. One area where, for me, I would really like to see Africa speaking in one voice, and that is at the UN. And to say 70 plus years ago, the UN was a site for a serious campaign for political independence for a lot of countries that are now identified as a global South. And it was very useful as a space for mobilizing, for norm setting, and for using UN to get political independence. I would argue that with the UN FACT report that I spoke about, financial accountability, transparency, and integrity, the UN can once more be the site for campaign for economic independence of African states and other states in the global South. So I would really like to call for Africa to speak in one voice when we're implementing the recommendations of the FACT panel report, which really is just the global equivalent of the recommendations of the Thabo Mbeki-led high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa, whose report was adopted by the AU 6 years ago. Reform of international financial institutions in our lifetime is very important. Creation of fair taxation globally through a UN tax body is crucial for us to achieve our domestic resource mobilization objectives, so we can implement the UN SDGs, we can implement our own AU Agenda 2063. So speaking in one voice there is very important. I would have spoken about speaking with one voice around rolling out the FCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the importance of maintaining unity so we don't have the distractions or the derailments of bilateral negotiations all over the place, but I think enough has been said about that. I would like to end with a final challenge for Africa. Can we have Africa CDC and the African Medicines Agency lead us now in the process of getting an African vaccine? It is not pie in the sky. Cuba, single country, is developing its own. It's at an advanced stage. Finland has the capacity. It is time we talked about what would be the sequence and what kind of time would we get if we put dedicated resources and oversight by the people of Africa that we having an African vaccine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dawn and Raymond.
Yes, so I just want to continue from where Dawn left off and say that African countries should be speaking in one voice, not only in relation to the illicit financial flows he talked about, but on the broader area of natural resource governance. That's our comparative advantage. But we don't speak in one voice when it comes to the governance of natural resources, not just in terms of how the outflows are going, but also, for example, the sites, the fora for dispute resolution when it comes to conflicts around natural resource contracts. So the whole panoply of things around the governance of our natural resources, we need to start speaking in one voice about that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. I actually want to start from where Mr. Dia finished in relation to the Africa CDC. Africa CDC is already taking a huge role. It's part of the African Union, and it's playing a huge role in countering COVID. And when it comes to the vaccine and developing an African vaccine, I read some news reports, of course, yet to be verified, but there are some countries in the continent that they are actually doing tests and trying to develop, including Egypt and South Africa, so to develop a vaccine. So if that works, then I think it will be good for all of us. But one of the things when it comes to speaking in one voice, I think apart from, of course, the political dimension, I'm very realistic. I worked in the UN, so I know how the dynamics work. I would say that one of the elements that we will all agree on, people, governments, and everybody, is development. Once we are talking about development, all of us will be speaking in one voice, regardless of how big or small the country in Africa is, how our economies are. This is something we all agree. The devil is in the details. Yes, we do differ in the details, but there is an avenue there where we can address it and speak in one voice. Just also to touch upon something, like I think we will speak in one voice if this takes place. One of the questions were put about the elimination of sovereign immunities and allowing US citizens to file cases against governments for damages and so on. This is something, if it takes place, that shows, number one, another unilateral decision by the US, which is contrary to customary international law and all the rules that we have studied all through our lives in international law. At the same time, I'm sure if that is issued, Africa will speak in one voice to say no. We do not accept the implementation of these decisions. So there are still a lot of avenues, and I would here jump from Africa to say we're not only speaking as Africa, we speak in political issues as non-aligned movement, or in the developmental aspects as G77 and China in the UN. So simply, there are a lot of things we can gather on, but I want to conclude that it's not about only having one voice on one element or an aspect. For me, I would say it is in relation to follow up the implementation, because this is where our problem is, and this is where it continues. Simply, we can speak like now, we have the CFTA, it's a very good example. Women projects in peace building, we all agree on these, but if we do not follow up and make sure that we are consistent in the implementation, then it will fall apart, and then it will be too much ado about nothing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And now we are to Professor Dewune.
Yeah, and I think the ambassador has given me a good segue. And my point is, when it comes to women's issues or women's rights and women's leadership, Africa, or the continent of Africa, should not make it a window dressing, right? So we don't want this kind of what people call sexy way of saying we have more women here, we have more women here. It's about giving them the capacity, giving them the voice, or hearing their voices, because they do have the voice. When they speak, when they make the decisions, when they bring their contributions to the table, that is what will make a difference. So we don't want to do a window dressing. But I take that back a bit and say that we also have to understand, and I hope that this is something that in terms of research and knowledge generation and decolonizing our minds from what feminism and women's rights is, The continent of Africa is a home where we have powerful women's leadership, historical perspective. Women across the continent have fought in wars. They have been spiritual leaders, religious leaders. They have been working economically, strong powerhouses economically. And so once again, not to belittle the point, but this is important, building this from an African-centric matriarchal perspective. Even looking at the example of Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, I look at it from the fact of women in Africa are powerful market women. They are the economic leaders. So when we're talking about GDP and all these numbers, we don't often look at women's contributions. Women contribute at the marketplace through trade and, of course, in agricultural production. So you're talking about the woman to be the leader of the WTO. That's a powerful market woman from the African perspective. Now, if you come closer to her home, Nigeria, and you come closer to her ethnic group, the Igbo, they are known to be good market people and business people. So nowhere else could we have that in terms of women's leadership than we see. So to end all of this, what do I say to Africa? Speaking in one voice or in many voices, African voices, I think it should be, like you said, James, that we have different voices, that we also have to be mindful that accountability begins with us. We should think for the long durée. What do we want 50 years from now? We have 2063, it's almost here. But what do we want for Africa many years from now? How are we going to make women part of the decision-making processes at the top level and at the lower level? The Obama administration had 8 years. It went by quickly. 4 years of Trump reversed a lot of the gains. And so with the Biden administration, it's my hope that they will have another 8 years. But 8 years is going to be nothing. Africa must prepare beyond 8 years to centralize women's leadership roles in the continent, across the continent, and therefore we can export that to the world. The gift to the world is what we've started doing already with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala at the WTO, and then Amina Mohammed at the UN, and I'm sure there are many other women who are going to rise up to these leadership positions globally. So we must speak with one voice from an African-centric matriarchal perspective, and don't make it a window dressing.
No window dressing, Danga. Now it's on you.
I think I could be very quick. I think the speakers before me have really said it all. And I would say that in investment reform, that it's not possible to speak in one voice, and it's not necessarily desirable to speak in one voice. And I think that actually what's more important is for states to identify their common interests, because the reality is that the economies are in different positions, the politics dictates that different solutions will be taken. But if states can find their common interest and then explore the different options to to achieve the common goals, then that will, I think, make the difference, because right now there isn't, the conversation isn't happening at the level that it should be happening, and that's at the level of really unpacking the different options for reform and trying to decide which is the best reform option for each of the different states. So if they come together, explore that common interest, explore the different options, I think that would be the big change domestically. But you know, I think what Professor Dawuni has said on being responsible ourselves is critical, because the accountability starts with ourselves. So if we hold ourselves accountable, then we can hold others accountable. But we can't do the second one without doing the first. So come together, find our common interests, hold ourselves accountable, and then only then hold the Biden-Harris administration accountable. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. This has really been great. Please join me in thanking our speakers for being really great. This was a really excellent conversation. And I think the society is making the recording, so it's going to be even more widely accessible to other people. So thank you very much to the American Society of International Law, but also to all the co-sponsoring societies. And I hope that this becomes a tradition and that we continue this tradition. Please remember to register for the annual meeting. It's completely free for students. Among the excellent things happening at this annual meeting, we'll be honoring Africa's own Judge Abdul Qawi Yusuf, who is a native of Somalia. The theme of this year's annual meeting is Reconceiving International Law, Creativity in Times of Crisis. Professor Darren Johnson, who you saw at the very beginning, maybe he can wave his hand if he's available, is one of the co-chairs of this year's annual meeting. and I'm sure he would be delighted to have as many of you here as possible. So thank you. So that's this Professor Darren Johnson, who's sort of the force behind the annual meeting this year and this global engagement series. So Darren, do you want to sign us off?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Gathi, and thank you to all the panelists for a wonderful discussion. And thank all of you that were able to join in. And we look forward to and hope to see you at the ASIL annual.